Welcome back to the Biblical Mystery Channel. Today's new story is the complete story of Barabbas, the man chosen over Jesus. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story. A condemned prisoner stood only moments away from death. The Roman authorities considered him a dangerous man, a participant in violence and rebellion, and his fate appeared certain. Yet, before that day was over, he would walk free, not because he was declared innocent, not because he escaped, but because another man was chosen to die in his place. For more than 2,000 years, the world has remembered the name of Jesus Christ, yet few stop to ask about the man who was released instead. Who was Barabbas? Was he a criminal, a revolutionary, or something far more complicated? Why did the crowd demand his freedom while sending Jesus to the cross? And what became of him after he disappeared from the pages of history? The answers lie at the intersection of biblical testimony, political unrest, Roman power, and one of the most extraordinary exchanges ever recorded. Today, we uncover the complete story of Barabbas, the forgotten prisoner whose life was forever changed on the day the world chose him over Jesus. History is filled with famous names: kings, generals, emperors, prophets, and revolutionaries often leave behind long records of their lives. We know where they were born, what they accomplished, and how they died. Yet occasionally a very different kind of figure emerges from the pages of history. A person appears only briefly, leaves almost no trace behind, and somehow becomes unforgettable. Barabbas is one of those figures. In the entire New Testament, he occupies only a small number of verses. He delivers no recorded speech. He performs no memorable act. No gospel writer describes his childhood, his family, his appearance, or his fate after a single dramatic day in Jerusalem. Compared to figures such as Peter, Pilate, Mary Magdalene, or even Judas Iscariot, Barabbas seems almost invisible. And yet for nearly 2,000 years, his name has remained woven into one of the most important stories ever told. That alone should make us pause and ask why. Why did the gospel writers preserve his story? Why did early Christians continue repeating his name? Why has a man who appears so briefly inspired centuries of sermons, books, films, theological reflection, and historical debate? The answer is not found in what Barabbas accomplished. It is found in the extraordinary moment in which his life intersected with the life of Jesus of Nazareth. In many ways, Barabbas stands at the edge of history. We know just enough about him to recognize his importance, yet not enough to fully understand him. This combination of significance and mystery is rare. Historians usually prefer abundant evidence. Barabbas offers the opposite. The more closely we examine him, the more questions emerge. Who was he before his arrest? What kind of movement was he involved in? Why had Roman authorities imprisoned him? How well known was he among the people of Jerusalem? What did he think when he discovered he would be released? And perhaps the greatest mystery of all, what happened to him after that day? The frustrating reality is that the sources provide very few answers. The Gospels mention him only when their narratives approach the final hours of Jesus' life. Then, almost as quickly as he appears, he disappears. From that point forward, history falls silent. No reliable ancient source records his later life. No contemporary historian tells us where he went. No early Christian document preserves his testimony. For a man connected to one of the most consequential events in human history, the absence of information is remarkable. Yet this silence may be part of the reason Barabbas continues to fascinate modern readers. Human beings are naturally drawn to unfinished stories. We want to know how events changed people. We want to understand what happened after life-altering moments. We want conclusions. Barabbas gives us none. Instead, he leaves behind a mystery. That mystery has encouraged generations of historians, theologians, and writers to search for clues hidden within the world of first-century Judea. To understand Barabbas properly, however, we must resist the temptation to fill the gaps with imagination. Throughout history, many legends have grown around his name. Some portray him as a hardened criminal. Others imagine him as a revolutionary hero. Some suggest he later became a follower of Jesus. Others picture him disappearing into obscurity. The problem is that most of these stories tell us more about later interpretations than about Barabbas himself. Responsible historical investigation requires a different approach. We must begin not with assumptions, but with evidence. We must separate what the Gospels actually say from what later generations wished they had said. We must distinguish history from tradition, probability from speculation, and documented facts from literary imagination. Only then can we appreciate why Barabbas occupies such a unique place within the Passion narrative. What makes this task especially important is that Barabbas did not exist in isolation. He lived within a specific world, a world shaped by Roman power, political unrest, religious expectation, economic hardship, and growing tension between rulers and the ruled. Understanding that environment is essential, because people like Barabbas do not emerge by accident. They are products of their time. The forces that shaped Judea also shaped him. Before we can understand the prisoner, we must understand the society that produced him. Before we can understand the choice that would later confront the crowd, we must understand the pressures building beneath the surface of everyday life. The story of Barabbas is therefore much larger than a single individual. It is also the story of a nation under occupation, a people longing for change, and a world moving toward a moment that would alter history forever. To uncover the complete story of Barabbas, we must first travel back to the turbulent landscape of first-century Judea, where political frustration, religious hope, and imperial power were on a collision course long before anyone heard the name Barabbas called from a Roman prison. To understand who Barabbas was, we must first understand the world that made a man like him possible. History does not occur in a vacuum. Individuals are shaped by the societies around them, and the story of Barabbas cannot be separated from the turbulent reality of first-century Judea. Long before his name appeared in the Gospel narratives, forces had been building across the region for generations. Political frustration, economic pressure, religious expectation, and imperial control had combined to create an atmosphere of tension, unlike almost anywhere else in the Roman world. By the time Jesus and Barabbas entered history, Judea was a land filled with uncertainty, resentment, hope, and growing instability. At the center of this story stood the Roman Empire. During the 1st century, Rome controlled vast territories stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its armies were feared. Its political influence was unmatched. Its administrative system allowed a single government to oversee millions of people from different cultures and languages. To Roman leaders, their rule represented order, stability, and civilization. To many of the peoples they conquered, however, Roman rule carried a very different meaning. It meant foreign domination, heavy taxation, military occupation, and the constant reminder that ultimate power belonged to someone else. For the Jewish population of Judea, this reality was especially painful because political control was not merely a practical issue. It was also deeply connected to religious identity. The Jewish people viewed their history through the lens of covenant and divine promise. Their scriptures told the story of a nation called by God, delivered from slavery, and established in a land that carried profound spiritual significance. Even during periods of hardship, many Jews believed that God would eventually restore Israel and fulfill the promises spoken by the prophets. As a result, Roman occupation was not experienced simply as a political inconvenience. For many, it felt like a contradiction of everything their history seemed to promise. This tension intensified as memories of Israel's past remained alive within the collective imagination of the people. Stories of Moses confronting Pharaoh, Joshua entering the Promised Land, and David defeating foreign enemies were not distant legends. They were foundational elements of Jewish identity. Every generation grew up hearing about God's intervention in history. Every generation inherited hopes for future restoration. Under Roman rule, those hopes did not disappear. If anything, they became stronger. Many people longed for a day when foreign powers would be removed, and Israel would once again enjoy freedom under God's authority. These expectations contributed to one of the most important developments of the period, the growing anticipation of a coming Messiah. Modern readers often associate the Messiah primarily with spiritual salvation, but many Jews living in the first century expected something much more visible and political. While views varied from group to group, numerous people anticipated a leader who would restore Israel, defeat its enemies, and establish God's kingdom in a tangible way. Such expectations created an environment in which revolutionary figures could attract attention and support. Anyone who appeared capable of challenging Roman authority might be viewed with interest by those longing for national liberation. At the same time, economic pressures added fuel to existing frustrations. Taxation under Roman administration could be burdensome, especially for ordinary farmers and laborers. Wealth was unevenly distributed. Land ownership increasingly concentrated in the hands of elites. Many families struggled to maintain stability in a system that often seemed designed to benefit those already in positions of power. Economic hardship alone does not create rebellion, but throughout history, it has frequently intensified social tensions and increased support for movements promising change. Judea was no exception. Political grievances and economic frustrations often reinforced one another. Religious divisions further complicated the situation. Jewish society was not united in its response to Roman rule. Different groups proposed different solutions. The Pharisees emphasized devotion to the law and religious faithfulness. The Sadducees, many of whom were connected to the temple leadership, tended to work within existing political structures. The Essenes withdrew from mainstream society and anticipated divine intervention. Other groups adopted more militant positions, believing that active resistance against Rome was justified. These differing visions reflected a society searching for answers in a time of uncertainty. Everyone recognized the problem. Agreement about the solution was far more difficult to achieve. Historical sources from the period reveal that unrest was not merely theoretical. The Jewish historian Josephus records numerous incidents involving rebellion, political violence, and messianic claimants throughout the decades surrounding the life of Jesus. Some movements attracted only small followings. Others grew large enough to alarm Roman authorities. Most, ultimately, ended in failure, often crushed by military force. Yet, the repeated appearance of such movements demonstrates how widespread dissatisfaction had become. Beneath the surface of daily life, many people believed that the existing situation could not continue forever. Jerusalem stood at the heart of these tensions. As the religious center of Jewish life, the city attracted pilgrims from across the region, particularly during major festivals. None was more significant than Passover. Every year, enormous crowds gathered to celebrate God's deliverance of Israel from Egyptian bondage. The symbolism was impossible to miss. A people living under foreign rule assembled to remember a story about liberation from foreign rule. Roman authorities understood the potential significance of this connection. Large gatherings combined with strong national and religious emotions could quickly become unpredictable. For this reason, governors and military commanders paid special attention to Jerusalem during festival seasons. Maintaining order was not merely desirable, it was essential. Within this environment, the line between criminality and resistance could become difficult to define. A person viewed by Rome as a threat to public order might be seen by others as a defender of national dignity. This does not mean every rebel was a hero or every Roman accusation was unjust. Rather, it highlights the complexity of a society living under occupation. Labels often depended on perspective. Understanding this reality is crucial because it helps explain why figures associated with rebellion could attract sympathy despite engaging in actions that involved violence. It also helps explain why the brief descriptions of Barabbas found in the Gospels must be interpreted within their broader historical context. By the early 1st century, Judea had become a land waiting for something to happen. Political tensions were rising. Messianic expectations were growing. Revolutionary movements periodically appeared and disappeared. Roman authorities remained vigilant. Religious leaders faced difficult choices. Ordinary people struggled to navigate an increasingly uncertain world. It was a society balanced between hope and frustration, between patience and resistance, between stability and unrest. This was the world that shaped Barabbas. This was the environment that transformed rebellion from an abstract idea into a lived reality. And it was within this volatile landscape that a man named Barabbas would eventually emerge, becoming part of a story that neither Rome nor Jerusalem could have fully anticipated. After exploring the volatile world of 1st century Judea, we can finally turn our attention to the man at the center of this story. Yet the moment we do, we encounter a surprising problem. For someone whose name has been remembered for nearly 2,000 years, Barabbas is remarkably difficult to identify. Historians often reconstruct ancient lives from letters, government records, inscriptions, family histories, or multiple independent accounts. In the case of Barabbas, almost none of those sources exist. Everything we know with reasonable confidence comes from a handful of references preserved within the 4 Gospels. That reality immediately places limits on what can be claimed. The goal is not to create a biography where none exists. The goal is to carefully examine what the sources actually say, and resist the temptation to go beyond the evidence. The first important observation is that Barabbas appears in all 4 canonical Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each include him in their accounts of Jesus' final hours. This consistency matters because it suggests that Barabbas was not a later addition to the tradition. Whatever else may be uncertain, his role in the Passion narrative appears deeply rooted in the earliest Christian memory of these events. The Gospel writers differ in style and emphasis, yet all agree that Barabbas was a prisoner whose fate became directly connected to that of Jesus. That shared testimony forms the foundation upon which all further discussion must rest. Beyond that basic agreement, each Gospel contributes a different piece of information. Matthew describes Barabbas as a notorious prisoner. The word suggests someone whose reputation was already known to the public. He was not an anonymous individual arrested for a minor offense. People apparently recognized his name and understood why he had been imprisoned. The description leaves open the question of whether that notoriety inspired fear, admiration, or both. But it indicates that Barabbas was not an obscure figure. His case had attracted attention before he ever stood alongside Jesus in the governor's court. Mark provides additional details that move us closer to understanding the nature of his crimes. According to Mark, Barabbas had been imprisoned with others involved in an insurrection and had participated in violence that resulted in death. This information immediately places him within a political context. The language does not describe an ordinary theft, personal dispute, or random act of violence. Instead, it points toward unrest connected to broader social and political tensions. Luke largely reinforces this picture, stating that Barabbas had been imprisoned because of an insurrection in the city and because of murder. Together, Mark and Luke present the image of a man associated with serious public disorder, rather than common criminal activity. John's Gospel takes a slightly different approach, identifying Barabbas with a term often translated as bandit or robber. At first glance, this description may seem inconsistent with the others, but many scholars caution against interpreting the term too narrowly. In the political environment of Roman Judea, similar language could sometimes be applied to insurgents, rebels, or armed resistance fighters. Ancient terminology did not always fit neatly into modern legal categories. As a result, most historians do not view John's description as fundamentally contradictory to the portraits found in Mark and Luke. Instead, all four accounts appear to point toward a man connected in some way to violence and political unrest. When these pieces are placed together, a general picture begins to emerge. Barabbas was likely a known prisoner. He had been arrested by Roman authorities. He was associated with an episode of rebellion or public disorder. Violence had occurred, and at least one death appears connected to the events surrounding his imprisonment. Beyond these broad conclusions, however, certainty becomes increasingly difficult. This is where many popular portrayals move beyond the evidence. Films, novels, and sermons often present Barabbas as a major revolutionary leader, a notorious criminal mastermind, or a symbol of organized resistance against Rome. While such depictions can be compelling, the Gospel texts themselves never provide that level of detail. They do not identify him as the leader of the insurrection. They do not describe the scale of the uprising. They do not reveal his rank, influence, or personal motivations. Any attempt to reconstruct those elements involves interpretation rather than direct historical knowledge. This distinction is important because the lack of information often tells us as much as the information we possess. The Gospel writers were clearly aware of Barabbas, yet they show little interest in exploring his background. They do not explain where he came from. They do not discuss his family. They do not recount the events that led to his arrest. Their focus remains elsewhere. Barabbas enters the narrative only because his story intersects with the story of Jesus. Once that purpose is fulfilled, the details of his personal life fade into the background. This literary choice reveals something significant about the priorities of the Gospel accounts. They are not attempting to provide a complete biography of every figure they mention. They are telling a larger story, and Barabbas appears within that story for a specific reason. Nevertheless, historians can draw several cautious conclusions. First, Barabbas was almost certainly a real historical individual, remembered within early Christian tradition. Second, his imprisonment appears connected to violence and political unrest rather than ordinary criminal behavior. Third, Roman authorities regarded him as serious enough to warrant incarceration during a period of heightened security in Jerusalem. These observations do not answer every question, but they establish a framework supported by the available evidence. At the same time, many mysteries remain. We do not know his age. We do not know his social status. We do not know whether he acted from political conviction, personal ambition, religious zeal, or some combination of motives. We do not know whether he expected release or assumed that execution awaited him. In fact, the closer we examine Barabbas, the more apparent it becomes that he stands at the boundary between history and uncertainty. There is just enough information to make him intriguing, yet not enough to fully explain him. Perhaps that is why he continues to attract so much attention. Historians are fascinated by figures who leave traces but not complete stories. Barabbas belongs to that category. He appears suddenly, influences one of the most important moments in the Passion narrative, and then disappears, before he vanishes. However, the Gospels leave us with one more clue. It is not found in a description of his crimes or his political activities. It is found in something far simpler: his name. For centuries, scholars have debated whether the name Barabbas contains a deeper significance than most readers realize. Some ancient manuscripts preserve a detail so unexpected that it has transformed the way many people think about this mysterious prisoner. To understand why, we must now look more closely at the meaning hidden behind the name Barabbas itself. At first glance, the name Barabbas seems like a minor detail. Most readers move past it without giving it much thought, focusing instead on the dramatic events surrounding Jesus' trial. Yet, throughout history, biblical scholars have repeatedly returned to this name because it may contain one of the most intriguing clues in the entire story. Unlike many questions surrounding Barabbas, this chapter is not primarily about his crimes, his political activities, or his mysterious fate after his release. Instead, it is about language, manuscripts, and the possibility that a single name can reveal how ancient audiences may have understood one of the most memorable moments in the Passion narrative. To appreciate why this matters, we must first understand how names functioned in the world of first-century Judea. In the ancient Near East, names often carried meanings that reflected family relationships, religious convictions, personal characteristics, or social identity. People frequently recognized the significance behind names in ways that modern readers sometimes overlook. A name was not merely a label. It could communicate information about ancestry, status, or cultural background. The name Barabbas belongs to that tradition. Most scholars agree that it derives from Aramaic, the language commonly spoken throughout much of Judea during the time of Jesus. The name is generally understood as a combination of two elements. Bar means son, while Abba means father. Together, the name is usually translated as son of the father. Historically speaking, this construction is not unusual. Similar naming patterns appear throughout the ancient world. What makes Barabbas noteworthy is not the existence of the name itself, but the context in which it appears. The moment we place that name within the Passion narrative, its significance becomes far more interesting. During Jesus' trial, the crowd is confronted with a choice involving a prisoner called Barabbas, literally son of the Father, and Jesus of Nazareth, whom the Gospels repeatedly present as possessing a unique relationship with God the Father. It is difficult not to notice the contrast. Even if the Gospel writers did not intend readers to focus heavily on the linguistic connection, the parallel naturally attracts attention. Over the centuries, theologians have often reflected on this irony, seeing symbolic significance in the juxtaposition of these two figures. Yet, before moving into questions of symbolism, we must examine another historical issue that has generated even greater debate. Some ancient manuscripts preserve a reading that many modern readers find surprising. In several textual traditions, Barabbas is not identified simply as Barabbas. Instead, he appears as Jesus Barabbas. If that reading reflects the original text, the scene before Pilate becomes even more striking. The crowd would have been asked to choose between Jesus Barabbas and Jesus who is called the Messiah. In other words, two men named Jesus would have stood before them. This possibility has fascinated textual critics for generations because it dramatically alters how the episode is imagined. It is important to understand that the name Jesus was not rare in the first century. The Greek form Jesus corresponds to the Hebrew name Joshua, a name widely used among Jewish communities of the period. Ancient records contain multiple individuals bearing the name. Therefore, the existence of another man named Jesus would not have seemed unusual to contemporary audiences. The real question is whether Barabbas actually carried that name. The evidence is intriguing but not conclusive. Some important manuscripts preserve the reading Jesus Barabbas, while many others omit the name Jesus entirely. As a result, scholars continue debating which version is more likely to represent the earliest form of the text. One argument in favor of the longer reading is based on the behavior of ancient scribes. Some scholars suggest that Christian copyists may have felt uncomfortable associating the revered name Jesus with a prisoner connected to violence and rebellion. If so, they may have removed the name during the process of manuscript transmission. This explanation would account for how Jesus Barabbas could gradually become simply Barabbas in later copies. Other scholars remain more cautious. They point out that manuscript traditions are complex and that multiple explanations are possible. In their view, certainty is difficult because the surviving evidence does not point decisively in a single direction. What makes this debate valuable is not merely the answer it may eventually provide. It also offers insight into how scholars study ancient texts. The process involves comparing manuscripts, evaluating scribal habits, examining historical context, and weighing competing explanations. Rather than blindly accepting a single tradition, textual criticism attempts to reconstruct the earliest attainable wording through careful analysis of available evidence. The discussion surrounding Jesus Barabbas serves as a useful example of how that process works in practice. Regardless of where one stands on the textual question, the broader significance of the name remains undeniable. Throughout Christian history, many interpreters have viewed the story as containing a striking contrast between two very different figures. One appears associated with rebellion, violence, and political unrest. The other is associated with teaching, healing, and the proclamation of God's kingdom. One enters the narrative as a prisoner. The other enters as a controversial religious figure. Their lives intersect for only a brief moment, yet that moment becomes unforgettable. The linguistic details surrounding Barabbas's name have only amplified the fascination surrounding the story. At the same time, historical caution remains essential. It is easy to move from interesting observations to exaggerated conclusions. The meaning of a name cannot tell us everything about a person. It cannot reveal Barabbas's motives, explain his actions, or solve the mysteries surrounding his life. What it can do is illuminate one small part of the cultural and textual world in which the story was preserved. The name Barabbas reminds us that even brief details within ancient sources can open unexpected avenues of investigation. Sometimes a single word leads to questions about language, history, manuscript transmission, and interpretation all at once. More importantly, this chapter marks a transition in our investigation. Until now, we have focused on what can be learned from the surviving evidence. We have examined the world of Judea, the gospel descriptions of Barabbas, and the mysteries surrounding his name. The next question takes us deeper into one of the most controversial issues in the entire story. What kind of man was Barabbas actually considered to be by those who knew his name? Was he simply a criminal? Was he a political insurgent? Was he viewed by some as a patriot resisting foreign domination? Or are all of those labels too simplistic for the realities of first-century Judea? To answer that question, we must move beyond names and examine the turbulent world of rebellion, resistance, and Roman power that shaped Barabbas's reputation. Few questions surrounding Barabbas generate more debate than this one. What kind of man was he actually? By this point in our investigation, we know that the Gospel writers associate him with insurrection, violence, and murder. We know that Roman authorities considered him dangerous enough to imprison. We know that his name was apparently recognized by those gathered during the events surrounding Jesus' trial. Yet, these facts alone do not tell us how people in first-century Judea would have viewed him. The challenge is that modern readers often approach ancient conflicts through contemporary categories that do not always fit the historical reality. Terms such as criminal, terrorist, revolutionary, insurgent, and freedom fighter carry strong emotional and political meanings today. Applying them directly to the ancient world can sometimes create more confusion than clarity. To understand Barabbas responsibly, we must first understand how power, resistance, and violence were perceived within Roman Judea itself. From the perspective of Roman authorities, the situation was relatively straightforward. Rome governed through stability. Any movement that threatened public order, challenged imperial authority, or encouraged rebellion was considered dangerous. It did not matter whether participants believed their cause was noble. What mattered was whether they disrupted the political system. The Roman state was particularly sensitive to insurrection because rebellions had the potential to spread rapidly and undermine control over entire regions. For this reason, those associated with uprisings often faced severe punishment. Roman law could be ruthless when dealing with individuals perceived as threats to the empire. Within that framework, a man associated with rebellion and violence would naturally be viewed as a criminal. Yet history rarely looks the same from every side of a conflict. While Roman officials saw rebels as threats, some inhabitants of occupied territories viewed resistance very differently. Throughout history, groups living under foreign domination have often produced individuals willing to challenge existing power structures. Such figures are frequently remembered in dramatically different ways, depending on who tells the story. One generation's rebel can become another generation's patriot. One government's criminal can become a symbol of resistance for those who oppose that government. This does not automatically transform every insurgent into a hero. It simply reminds us that political labels are often shaped by perspective. This broader historical reality is especially relevant in Judea, where many people longed for liberation from foreign rule. As we explored earlier, first-century Jewish society contained a variety of responses to Roman occupation. Some advocated accommodation. Some emphasized spiritual renewal. Some awaited divine intervention. Others believed more active forms of resistance were justified. Within such an environment, individuals involved in anti-Roman activities could attract support from certain segments of the population, even while being condemned by the authorities. This context helps explain why the descriptions of Barabbas should not be interpreted too simplistically. The Gospels identify his actions. They do not tell us how every member of society judged those actions. A particularly important question involves possible connections between Barabbas and broader revolutionary currents within Judea. Over the years, some scholars have suggested that he may have been associated with movements that shared similarities with groups later known as the Zealots. It is important to emphasize the word suggested. The Gospels never explicitly identify Barabbas as a zealot. No surviving source links him directly to a specific organization. The evidence simply does not allow such certainty. What scholars can say is that the activities attributed to Barabbas occurred within a historical environment where revolutionary ideas were increasingly present. Whether he belonged to a structured movement, participated in a localized uprising, or acted within a smaller network of resistance remains unknown. This distinction is crucial because responsible history must avoid overstating the evidence. Another factor complicates the discussion. Ancient sources often use language differently than modern readers expect. Terms translated as bandit, robber, or brigand sometimes carried political implications in Roman-era writings. Historians studying Josephus have noted that similar terminology could be applied to individuals involved in anti-Roman activity. This does not mean every bandit was a revolutionary, nor does it mean every revolutionary was merely a criminal. It means the categories frequently overlapped. Violence, politics, and social unrest were deeply intertwined. As a result, the labels attached to Barabbas cannot always be separated neatly into modern classifications. Perhaps the most historically responsible conclusion is also the most cautious. Barabbas appears to have been involved in an act of violent unrest connected in some way to broader tensions within Judea. Beyond that point, certainty becomes difficult. We do not know the precise goals of the uprising. We do not know how many people participated. We do not know whether Barabbas held a leadership role or functioned as a relatively minor participant. The surviving evidence establishes his connection to violence and rebellion, but it does not provide a detailed political biography. This uncertainty frustrates those seeking simple answers, yet it also reveals something important about the nature of historical inquiry. Ancient history often requires scholars to work with probabilities rather than certainties. Despite these uncertainties, one contrast remains impossible to ignore. Both Barabbas and Jesus lived under the same Roman system. Both witnessed the same social tensions. Both existed within a society longing for change. Yet the paths associated with them appear fundamentally different. The limited evidence surrounding Barabbas points toward confrontation with political authority through violence. The gospel portrayal of Jesus points toward a very different approach. Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God, but he consistently resisted attempts to transform his mission into an armed political movement. He challenged expectations, disappointed some who sought a military liberator, and presented a vision of power unlike the one many anticipated. This contrast does not fully emerge until the final chapters of the story, but its roots are already visible here. In many ways, Barabbas and Jesus came to represent two very different responses to the crisis facing Judea. One response looked toward resistance through force. The other pointed toward transformation through sacrifice and faithfulness. Understanding this distinction helps explain why the choice presented later in the narrative became so memorable. It was not merely a decision between two individuals. It reflected deeper tensions within the society that produced them. Yet, before that choice could occur, another reality shaped the events of Jerusalem. The city was entering Passover, the most politically sensitive season of the year. Roman officials were watching carefully. Crowds were gathering in enormous numbers. Expectations were rising, and at the center of it all stood Pontius Pilate, a governor whose next decisions would forever connect the stories of Jesus and Barabbas in ways neither man could have anticipated. By the time Jesus and Barabbas entered the final stage of their stories, Jerusalem had become one of the most politically sensitive cities in the Roman Empire. Every major festival brought enormous crowds into the city. But Passover was different. Passover was not merely a religious celebration. It was a national memory. It commemorated the moment when Israel believed God had delivered the nation from foreign oppression in Egypt. For generations, Jewish families had gathered to remember liberation, covenant, and divine intervention. Under normal circumstances, such remembrance was spiritually meaningful. Under Roman occupation, it carried unavoidable political implications as well. Thousands of pilgrims entered Jerusalem, reflecting on a story about freedom while living under the authority of a foreign empire. Roman officials understood the potential significance of that reality: religious enthusiasm, national identity, and political frustration could become a volatile combination. For that reason, maintaining order during Passover was one of the governor's most important responsibilities. The man responsible for that task was Pontius Pilate. Although he appears only briefly in the Passion narratives, Pilate was one of the most powerful individuals in Judea, appointed by Rome. He governed the region on behalf of the emperor and possessed the authority to enforce imperial law. His primary duty was not theological judgment or religious arbitration. It was stability. Rome expected its governors to keep order, collect taxes, discourage unrest, and ensure that local problems did not become imperial crises. Historical sources outside the New Testament help us understand the type of administrator Pilate appears to have been. Writers, such as Josephus and Philo, describe incidents in which he clashed with segments of the Jewish population. Their accounts portray a governor who could be stubborn, politically calculating, and willing to use force when he believed circumstances required it. While historians continue debating aspects of his character, few view him as a weak or indecisive ruler. He governed a difficult province and understood the consequences of losing control. This context is important because it shapes how we interpret the events surrounding Jesus and Barabbas. When the Gospels introduce Pilate into the story, he is not simply evaluating two prisoners. He is managing a potentially dangerous situation during one of the most sensitive weeks of the year. Jerusalem is crowded, emotions are elevated, religious leaders are involved, public attention is growing. Every decision carries political consequences. Within this environment, both Jesus and Barabbas present different kinds of challenges. Barabbas appears connected to rebellion and violence. Jesus faces accusations that touch upon questions of authority, kingship, and public influence. Neither case exists in isolation from the broader realities of Roman rule. To understand why Barabbas' situation was particularly serious, we must briefly consider how Rome dealt with rebellion. The Roman Empire could tolerate many things. It often allowed conquered peoples to preserve local customs, languages, and religious practices. What it could not tolerate was organized resistance. Rebellion threatened the foundation of imperial authority. As a result, Rome frequently responded with overwhelming force against those associated with insurrection. Punishments were designed not only to discipline offenders but also to discourage future resistance. Crucifixion played a central role within that system. Contrary to popular imagination, crucifixion was not used primarily for ordinary criminal offenses. It was often reserved for slaves, rebels, insurgents, and individuals considered threats to public order. It functioned as both execution and public warning. The message was unmistakable. Challenge Rome, and this could be your fate. This background makes Barabbas' presence in prison especially significant. If the gospel descriptions are accurate, he belonged to exactly the category of offender Roman authorities typically treated harshly. Under ordinary circumstances, his future would have appeared bleak. Yet the circumstances unfolding in Jerusalem were far from ordinary. The gospel narratives introduce a custom associated with the Passover season, whereby a prisoner could be released to the people. According to the accounts, Pilate presented the crowd with a choice involving Jesus and Barabbas. This detail has generated extensive scholarly discussion because no surviving Roman source explicitly confirms the existence of such a practice in Judea. Some historians view this absence of evidence with caution. Others note that much of the administrative history of the ancient world has been lost, and that local customs are often preserved only in isolated references. The most responsible conclusion is that certainty remains elusive. The gospel tradition clearly remembers such a release mechanism, but external verification remains limited. Importantly, the historical uncertainty surrounding the custom does not eliminate the central reality preserved in the narrative. The Gospels unanimously present a moment in which Barabbas' fate became linked to Jesus' fate. Regardless of how the procedure functioned administratively, the story consistently portrays Pilate facing a choice that carried political risk. From the perspective of Roman governance, Barabbas was the more obvious security concern. Jesus, despite the accusations against him, does not appear in the Gospels as the leader of an armed movement. This contrast raises an obvious question. Why would Pilate place both men within the same decision-making process? Scholars have proposed various explanations. Some suggest he viewed Jesus as less dangerous and hoped the crowd would support his release. Others argue that political calculations, negotiations with local leaders, and concerns about public reaction all played a role. The surviving evidence does not allow a definitive answer. What is clear is that Pilate found himself navigating a complex situation in which legal considerations, political pressures, and crowd dynamics intersected. Another common misunderstanding concerns the crowd itself. Popular imagination often pictures all of Jerusalem united in a single voice. Historically, that image is unlikely. Jerusalem contained a diverse population, especially during Passover. Most scholars believe the crowd described in the Gospels represented a specific gathering connected to the proceedings rather than the entire city. Exactly who was present remains uncertain, but the distinction matters. Historical events are often shaped by particular groups operating within particular circumstances rather than by unanimous public consensus. As the tension increased, every element of the story began converging toward a decisive moment. The Roman governor responsible for maintaining order, the prisoner associated with rebellion, the teacher from Galilee whose growing influence had become controversial, religious leaders seeking a resolution, crowds gathered during the most politically charged festival of the year. None of these factors alone would have created the moment that followed. Together, they produced one of the most consequential scenes in the Passion narrative. The stage was now set. Pilate would soon present a choice. The crowd would soon respond. And the destinies of Jesus and Barabbas, which had developed along entirely different paths, were about to collide in a way that neither history nor Christian memory would ever forget. Everything in the story now converges upon a single decision: the tensions of Roman occupation, the expectations surrounding the Messiah, the unrest simmering beneath the surface of Judean society, the arrest of Jesus, the imprisonment of Barabbas, the political calculations facing Pontius Pilate. What had previously existed as separate threads now becomes one dramatic moment. According to all four Gospels, a choice was placed before a crowd in Jerusalem. One prisoner would be released. The other would be sent toward execution. Few scenes in the New Testament have generated more discussion, more interpretation, and more emotional reaction than this one. Yet, before asking why the crowd chose Barabbas, we must first understand what the sources actually describe. The Gospel accounts agree on the central event. Pilate presents Jesus and Barabbas. A choice is made. Barabbas is released. Jesus is condemned. Beyond that shared framework, each Gospel emphasizes different details. As is often the case with ancient historical sources, the writers are less concerned with providing a modern transcript of events than with preserving the significance of what occurred. When read together, the accounts reveal a scene marked by political tension, public pressure, uncertainty, and rapidly unfolding decisions. One of the most common misconceptions about this episode involves the crowd itself. Popular retellings often portray the entire city of Jerusalem standing together and unanimously demanding the release of Barabbas. Historically, such a picture is unlikely. Jerusalem during Passover contained a large and diverse population made up of local residents, pilgrims, religious leaders, merchants, and visitors from across the region. Most scholars believe the gathering described in the Gospels was a specific crowd connected to the proceedings rather than the entire population of the city. This distinction is important because it helps prevent oversimplified conclusions. Ancient societies, like modern ones, rarely spoke with a single voice. The Gospels also indicate that influential leaders played a role in shaping the situation. Matthew and Mark specifically mention chief priests encouraging the crowd to ask for Barabbas. The exact mechanics of this influence remain unclear, but the broader historical reality is familiar. Public opinion is often affected by respected authorities. political interests, social pressures, and group dynamics. The people gathered before Pilate were not making their decision in isolation. They were responding within a larger environment of competing voices, expectations, and tensions. Understanding this context allows us to approach the scene with greater historical nuance. The deeper question, however, remains the same. Why Barabbas? For many modern readers, the decision seems difficult to understand. Looking back through 2,000 years of Christian history, Jesus appears as one of the most influential figures the world has ever known. Yet, the people present that day did not possess the perspective of future generations. They were responding to immediate circumstances, not to centuries of subsequent history. Some may have viewed Jesus with suspicion because of the charges brought against him. Others may have been disappointed by his refusal to fulfill certain popular expectations regarding political liberation. Some may have viewed Barabbas more sympathetically because of his apparent opposition to Roman authority. The motivations within the crowd were likely varied and complex rather than uniform. The historical environment of Judea makes this possibility easier to understand. As we have seen, many Jews longed for deliverance from foreign domination. The memory of past national independence remained powerful. Expectations concerning a future restoration of Israel were widespread. Within that context, a man associated with resistance against Rome could potentially attract support from those who saw liberation as an urgent priority. This does not mean everyone approved of violence, nor does it mean everyone supported Barabbas personally. It simply reminds us that first-century political realities were far more complicated than modern readers sometimes assume. Another factor worth considering is the psychology of crowds. Historians and social scientists have long observed that collective behavior often differs from individual behavior. Emotions can spread rapidly. Social pressures can intensify. Decisions can become simplified into symbolic choices. In highly charged situations, groups may respond in ways that individual members would not necessarily predict beforehand. While we cannot reconstruct the precise emotional atmosphere of that morning, the Gospel accounts describe conditions that frequently contribute to heightened collective reactions. Political tension, religious controversy, public uncertainty, and competing leadership influences were all present at the same time. Within such an environment, events could develop quickly, yet, perhaps the most striking feature of the scene is the contrast represented by the two men standing before the crowd. On one side stands Barabbas, a prisoner associated with violence and insurrection. On the other stands Jesus, whose public ministry emphasized teaching, healing, forgiveness, and the proclamation of God's kingdom. From a purely narrative perspective, the contrast is dramatic. The man linked to rebellion receives freedom. The teacher from Galilee moves closer to death. The reversal is so unexpected that it has remained one of the defining images of the Passion story. Historians may debate specific details surrounding the event, but the power of the scene itself is undeniable. The Gospels also portray Pilate as surprised by the outcome. Whether motivated by political calculation, legal reasoning, or a desire to avoid greater conflict, he appears to have expected a different result. Once the crowd's choice became clear, however, the situation changed rapidly. The decision effectively set the final phase of the Passion narrative into motion. What had previously been uncertain now became increasingly inevitable. The path toward Golgotha began to take shape. For Barabbas, the moment must have been extraordinary. Only hours earlier, he appears to have been a prisoner facing severe consequences. Suddenly, his circumstances changed. The sentence he likely expected did not arrive. Instead, he was released. The sources do not record his reaction. They offer no description of his thoughts, emotions, or actions. We do not know whether he felt relief, confusion, gratitude, disbelief, or some combination of all four. The silence is striking, yet perhaps appropriate. The focus of the Gospel writers remains fixed elsewhere. Their attention is moving toward the events that will follow. Nevertheless, the image remains unforgettable. A man associated with rebellion walks away from Roman custody. Another man begins the final journey toward crucifixion. The decision made that day would echo far beyond the political circumstances of Jerusalem. What appeared to be a legal and public choice would later acquire enormous significance within Christian thought. For generations of believers, the release of Barabbas would come to represent far more than a historical event. It would become a powerful symbol through which larger questions about mercy, justice, redemption, and human destiny could be explored. And it is that deeper layer of meaning that brings us to the theological center of the entire story. The extraordinary exchange that has fascinated Christians, scholars, and readers for nearly 2 millennia. Up to this point, we have examined the story of Barabbas through the lenses of history, politics, and textual analysis. We have explored the realities of Roman Judea, the evidence preserved in the Gospels, the debates surrounding his identity, and the dramatic moment when the crowd chose his release. Yet, it is here, more than anywhere else in the narrative, that history begins to intersect with theology. For while historians are primarily concerned with what happened, generations of Christians have asked a different question. What did it mean? The release of Barabbas became one of the most discussed moments in Christian reflection, not because of the amount of information the Gospels provide, but because of the profound symbolism many believers discovered within it. The scene itself is deceptively simple. A prisoner is released. Another prisoner is condemned. On the historical level, that is essentially what the sources describe. Yet even within the narrative, the contrast is difficult to ignore. Barabbas appears associated with violence, rebellion, and bloodshed. Jesus appears associated with teaching, healing, and the proclamation of God's kingdom. One man leaves custody. The other proceeds toward crucifixion. The reversal is so dramatic that it naturally invites reflection. Long before theologians developed formal doctrines, early Christians were already contemplating the significance of this extraordinary exchange. One reason the story attracted so much attention is that it seemed to embody a pattern visible throughout the New Testament, again and again. The gospel message emphasizes themes of mercy, forgiveness, restoration, and undeserved favor. Within that broader framework, the story of Barabbas appeared to many believers as a vivid illustration rather than a formal theological argument. The Gospels never pause to explain Barabbas symbolically. They simply narrate what occurred. Yet, readers throughout history often saw more than a legal decision taking place. They saw an image that echoed larger themes running through Christian belief. It is important, however, to distinguish carefully between historical evidence and theological interpretation. Historically, we can examine the event itself. We can analyze the political circumstances surrounding the trial, the role of Pilate, the crowd's decision, and the gospel accounts that preserve the story. Theology asks a different kind of question. Rather than asking only what happened, it asks why the event matters and how it should be understood within a larger vision of God's relationship with humanity. These are related inquiries, but they are not identical. Understanding that distinction allows us to appreciate both the historical reality of the event and the interpretive traditions that developed around it. Among many Christian theologians, Barabbas eventually came to symbolize the human condition. This interpretation emerged not because the Gospels explicitly identify him in such a role, but because his situation appeared to mirror broader theological themes. He enters the narrative as a condemned prisoner. His future appears uncertain. Then, through a sequence of events beyond his control, he receives freedom, while another individual faces death. For many Christian readers, this pattern resonated deeply with concepts such as grace, redemption, and divine mercy. The image proved powerful precisely because it was concrete. It transformed abstract theological ideas into a memorable human story. Yet one of the most fascinating aspects of the account is the silence surrounding Barabbas himself. The Gospels never tell us what he thought about his release. They never record a conversation between him and Jesus. They never describe his reaction as events unfolded. In fact, the story's emotional center is left almost entirely to the imagination of the reader. This literary silence has played a major role in the story's enduring influence. People naturally wonder what it would feel like to stand in Barabbas's position, what thoughts would race through the mind of someone who expected punishment and suddenly received freedom instead. How would a person process such a reversal? The sources offer no answers. Yet perhaps that absence is precisely what gives the story much of its power. Every generation finds itself imagining the moment anew. The symbolism becomes even more intriguing when viewed alongside themes already explored in earlier chapters. Some Christian interpreters have reflected on the meaning of Barabbas's name, often translated as Son of the Father. Others have considered the textual tradition that preserves the reading Jesus Barabbas in certain manuscripts, while scholars continue debating the historical significance of these details. Their symbolic impact on Christian thought has been substantial. Throughout church history, many writers have noted the dramatic contrast presented by the narrative. Whether these parallels were intended by the gospel writers or emerged through later reflection remains a matter of interpretation. What cannot be denied is the influence they have exerted upon Christian imagination for centuries. At the same time, reducing the story solely to symbolism risks overlooking its historical significance. Barabbas was not merely an illustration within a theological lesson. He was a real individual living within a real political crisis. The choices made during Jesus' trial occurred within a complex world shaped by Roman authority, religious tensions, and competing visions for the future of Judea. The power of the story comes partly from the fact that it operates on both levels simultaneously. It remains rooted in history while also inviting deeper reflection. That combination helps explain why it continues to resonate with readers across cultures and centuries. Another reason the account remains compelling is that it raises enduring questions about justice and mercy. Human societies often struggle to balance these values. People generally expect wrongdoing to be punished and innocence to be vindicated. The story of Barabbas complicates those expectations. It presents an outcome that feels surprising, even unsettling, whether one approaches the narrative historically, philosophically, or theologically. It forces reflection on how justice operates and how mercy can alter human destinies. Such questions extend far beyond the specific circumstances of first-century Jerusalem. They remain relevant wherever people wrestle with law, forgiveness, responsibility, and hope. Yet perhaps the greatest mystery remains the simplest one: what happened after the exchange was over. The theological significance of the event would continue growing for centuries, but Barabbas himself still had a life to live. The gates of imprisonment opened. The crowd dispersed. Attention shifted toward Golgotha. Jesus moved toward the crucifixion. Barabbas moved back into the world. And then, almost immediately, he vanished from the historical record. The Gospels never follow him beyond that moment. They leave him standing at the edge of the story, carrying with him one of the most extraordinary experiences imaginable. It is there, in that silence, that we encounter the next chapter of our investigation. For after all the theological reflection, one historical question still remains unanswered. What became of Barabbas after the day that changed his life forever? The moment Barabbas walked out of prison, he entered one of the largest silences in the entire New Testament. For 8 chapters, we have followed the historical, political, and theological dimensions of his story. We have examined the world that shaped him, the crimes associated with his name, the debates surrounding his identity, and the extraordinary events that led to his release. Yet, when we finally arrive at the question many people find most fascinating, the historical record suddenly disappears. The Gospels tell us what happened before Barabbas was freed. They tell us nothing about what happened afterward. No farewell scene follows. No later appearance is recorded. No ancient author describes where he went, how he lived, or how he died. One moment he stands at the center of one of history's most famous trials. The next moment he vanishes. For historians, that silence is both frustrating and revealing. It reminds us that the ancient world often preserves only fragments of human lives. Modern readers sometimes forget how little information survives from antiquity. Even individuals who participated in important events frequently disappear from the historical record once those events conclude. Ancient historians were selective. Documents were lost, records were destroyed. Entire archives vanished over the centuries. In that sense, Barabbas is not unique. What makes his disappearance remarkable is the event from which he disappears. Few people in history have found themselves connected so directly to one of the most consequential moments in the Christian story. Yet, despite that connection, almost nothing reliable can be said about the remainder of his life. This absence of evidence has created a natural temptation. Whenever history leaves a gap, imagination often rushes in to fill it. Over the centuries, countless writers, artists, theologians, and storytellers have attempted to answer the question the sources leave unresolved. What became of Barabbas after his release? Some imagined a dramatic transformation. Others imagined continued rebellion. Still others created entirely fictional narratives designed to explore the emotional and spiritual implications of his experience. These stories reveal much about the concerns of later generations, but very little about the historical Barabbas himself. Responsible historical analysis requires us to begin with a simple acknowledgement. We do not know what happened next. Nevertheless, the possibilities are worth examining because they help illustrate the difference between evidence and speculation. One of the most common traditions imagines Barabbas witnessing the crucifixion. The idea is understandable. If a man unexpectedly received freedom while another person was condemned in his place, curiosity alone might draw him toward the site of execution. Many readers have found it difficult to imagine Barabbas simply walking away without looking back. As a result, countless sermons, novels, films, and artistic works have pictured him standing somewhere near Golgotha, watching the events unfold. Yet, despite the popularity of this image, the Gospels never mention Barabbas at the crucifixion. The scene remains possible, but it remains speculative. History cannot confirm it. Another tradition suggests that Barabbas eventually became a follower of Jesus. Once again, the appeal of this interpretation is easy to understand. The experience of sudden release appears so dramatic that many people naturally imagine it producing lasting change. According to these stories, Barabbas spends years reflecting on the events of that day, encounters members of the early Christian movement, and gradually comes to faith. Such narratives have inspired generations of readers because they offer emotional closure. Yet, historical evidence is entirely absent. No New Testament text, early Christian document, or reliable ancient source supports this conclusion. It remains a possibility, but only a possibility. Other interpretations move in the opposite direction. Some imagine that Barabbas returned immediately to the world from which he came. If he had been involved in anti-Roman activities before his arrest, perhaps he resumed them after his release. Perhaps he became involved in later conflicts that eventually culminated in the Jewish revolt against Rome in the decades after Jesus' death. Again, the problem is not that such scenarios are impossible. The problem is that there is no evidence. They represent imaginative reconstructions rather than historical conclusions. The farther we move beyond the gospel accounts, the more uncertain every proposed narrative becomes. This distinction between evidence and imagination becomes especially important when examining literary portrayals of Barabbas. Among the most influential is the 20th century novel Barabbas by Swedish author Per Lagerkvist. The book presents a fictional exploration of a man struggling to understand the significance of the individual who died after he was released. Through encounters with early Christians and personal experiences of doubt, loss, and searching, the novel transforms Barabbas into a vehicle for exploring larger questions about faith and meaning. It became enormously influential and shaped the way many modern readers imagine Barabbas, yet it remains a work of literature rather than history. Its power lies not in historical reconstruction, but in philosophical and spiritual reflection. The popularity of such works reveals something significant. People are fascinated by Barabbas not because of what is known about him, but because of what is unknown. Most biblical figures leave behind identifiable stories. Barabbas leaves behind a question mark. He occupies a rare position between history and mystery. There is enough information to establish his existence and significance, but not enough to complete the narrative. That combination creates a powerful sense of unfinished business. Readers instinctively want to know more. Historians, however, must learn to live with uncertainty. Sometimes the most honest conclusion is that the evidence simply ends. Interestingly, the gospel writers themselves seem entirely comfortable with this silence. Their attention remains focused on Jesus. Once Barabbas leaves the scene, the narrative moves rapidly toward the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. The future of the released prisoner is not their concern. This observation is important because it reminds us that the Gospels were never intended to be biographies of Barabbas. His role is significant, but it is limited. He enters the story because his release forms part of a larger sequence of events. Once that purpose is fulfilled, the narrative follows a different path. Yet, the silence left behind continues to invite reflection, not because it provides answers, but because it forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge. Perhaps that is why Barabbas remains so memorable. History rarely gives us complete stories. More often, it gives us fragments. A name, a moment, a decision, a life briefly illuminated before disappearing once more into darkness. Barabbas is one of those figures. We know enough to understand why he mattered. We do not know enough to fully explain him, and after nearly 2,000 years, that mystery remains unresolved. Yet, while the fate of Barabbas may never be known, the questions surrounding his story have inspired generations of scholars to investigate what can still be learned. Those investigations have produced some of the most fascinating debates in modern biblical scholarship. Debates that continue shaping how historians understand Barabbas and the world in which he lived. By now, one fact should be clear. The story of Barabbas is not difficult because it lacks importance. It is difficult because it sits at the intersection of history, memory, theology, and limited evidence. Throughout this documentary, we have repeatedly encountered moments where the available sources provide enough information to establish a basic outline, but not enough to answer every question. This is not unusual in ancient history. In fact, it is often the norm. Yet the case of Barabbas offers a particularly valuable example of how modern scholarship works, because it forces historians to confront uncertainty directly. The most interesting debates surrounding Barabbas are not simply about reaching conclusions. They are about understanding what can reasonably be known, what remains probable, and what may never be answered with certainty. One of the most important discussions concerns the Passover release tradition described in the Gospels. According to the Gospel narratives, Pilate presented a choice that resulted in Barabbas being released. At first glance, this may appear straightforward. Yet historians immediately ask a broader question. Do we possess independent evidence confirming such a practice? The answer is more complicated than many people expect. No surviving Roman document explicitly describes a governor in Judea regularly releasing a prisoner during Passover. For some scholars, this absence raises legitimate questions. Others caution that the overwhelming majority of ancient administrative records have not survived. The Roman world produced enormous quantities of documentation, but only a small fraction remains today. As a result, the absence of external confirmation does not automatically invalidate the Gospel account. The debate, therefore, remains open. More importantly, it demonstrates a key principle of historical research. Evidence must be weighed carefully, but silence in the historical record is not always evidence against an event. Another discussion focuses on the name of Barabbas itself. As we explored earlier, some ancient manuscripts preserve the reading Jesus Barabbas. This textual variant has attracted significant scholarly attention because it potentially alters how readers understand the choice presented before the crowd. If the longer reading is original, then two men named Jesus stood before Pilate. If the shorter reading is original, then the symbolism often associated with that possibility becomes less direct. Scholars continue evaluating manuscript evidence, scribal habits, and textual transmission in an effort to determine which reading is more likely. What makes this debate valuable is not merely the answer it may eventually provide. It reveals the extraordinary care with which ancient texts are studied. Rather than assuming that every manuscript is identical, textual critics compare hundreds of copies, examine patterns of transmission, and attempt to reconstruct the earliest attainable text. The discussion surrounding Barabbas therefore offers a fascinating glimpse into the discipline of textual criticism itself. A third debate concerns Barabbas's political identity. Modern readers often want a simple label. Was he a criminal, a revolutionary, a nationalist, a terrorist, a freedom fighter? Yet, the further scholars investigate these possibilities, the more cautious many become. The Gospel accounts establish his connection to violence and insurrection, but they provide very few details beyond that. Some researchers have suggested possible links between Barabbas and broader revolutionary currents present in Judea during the 1st century. Others argue that the evidence is too limited to support specific conclusions. The result is a debate that says as much about historical methodology as it does about Barabbas himself. Ancient sources often resist the categories modern readers wish to impose upon them. Sometimes the most accurate answer is also the least satisfying. We simply do not know enough to be certain. Questions surrounding Pontius Pilate create another area of discussion. Historical sources portray Pilate as an administrator concerned with maintaining order in a politically sensitive province. Yet scholars continue debating the precise motivations behind his actions during Jesus' trial. Was he attempting to avoid unrest? Was he making a political calculation? Was he responding to pressure from local leaders? The surviving evidence allows multiple interpretations. Once again, the debate reminds us that ancient history often involves evaluating probabilities rather than uncovering definitive answers. Historians work with fragments, not complete records. They reconstruct possibilities rather than replay events with perfect clarity. Similar questions arise regarding the crowd described in the Gospels. Who exactly was present? How representative was the gathering of the broader population of Jerusalem? To what extent did influential leaders shape the outcome? These questions remain difficult because the sources do not provide detailed demographic information. Yet examining them helps historians avoid simplistic conclusions. The image of an entire city speaking with one voice may be emotionally powerful, but historical reality was almost certainly more complex. Understanding that complexity allows us to appreciate the event without reducing it to caricature. Perhaps the most valuable lesson emerging from all these debates is that uncertainty is not a weakness of scholarship. It is one of its strengths. Popular culture often presents history as a collection of established facts waiting to be discovered. Real historical research is usually more nuanced. Scholars evaluate evidence, test hypotheses, challenge assumptions, and revise conclusions when new information becomes available. The goal is not to eliminate every mystery. The goal is to understand the available evidence as accurately and honestly as possible. In that sense, Barabbas represents an excellent case study. The questions surrounding him have encouraged historians to explore Roman administration, Jewish society, manuscript traditions, political resistance movements, and the methods used to reconstruct the ancient world. Yet, after all the debates, a remarkable degree of agreement still exists. Most scholars accept that Barabbas was a real individual, remembered within early Christian tradition. Most agree that he was associated with violence and political unrest. Most recognize that his release formed an established part of the Passion narrative from a very early stage. The major disagreements involve interpretation rather than existence. The debates concern details, context, and significance, not whether Barabbas himself belonged to the story. This distinction is important because it prevents scholarly discussion from being misunderstood. Historians may disagree about many aspects of Barabbas, but they are generally debating around a common historical core rather than questioning everything equally. In many ways, that reality captures the essence of responsible historical inquiry. We rarely possess complete certainty. We rarely possess complete ignorance. Most of the time, we operate somewhere in between, balancing evidence, probability, and humility. The story of Barabbas reminds us that the ancient world is both knowable and mysterious. Some questions can be answered, others remain open, and perhaps that balance is precisely why his story continues to fascinate scholars after 2 millennia. Yet, once the debates are set aside, one final question remains. Why has this brief and largely unknown prisoner continued to capture the imagination of historians, theologians, writers, and ordinary readers for so long? The answer lies not only in what happened to Barabbas, but in what his story has come to represent. To understand that legacy, we must now turn to the final chapter of our journey and consider the enduring significance of the man who walked free. At the beginning of this journey, we asked a simple question: who was Barabbas? The answer seemed straightforward at first. A prisoner briefly mentioned in the Gospels, a man associated with rebellion and violence, a figure standing near the edge of the Passion narrative. Yet, as we followed the evidence, the story became far more complex. What initially appeared to be a minor character gradually revealed himself as one of the most intriguing individuals connected to the final days of Jesus, not because of what he accomplished, not because of what he taught, not because of what history remembers about his later life. In fact, the opposite is true. Barabbas remains fascinating, precisely because so much about him is unknown. Few figures in the New Testament stand at the intersection of historical significance and historical mystery as completely as he does. Looking back across the events we have explored, it becomes clear that Barabbas was more than an isolated individual caught in an unfortunate situation. His story serves as a window into the world of first-century Judea. Through him, we glimpse the tensions created by Roman occupation. We see the frustrations that fueled resistance movements. We encounter competing expectations concerning the future of Israel. We observe how politics, religion, public opinion, and imperial power could collide within a single moment. In that sense, the story of Barabbas is not only about one man, it is also about the society that produced him. Understanding Barabbas has required understanding the larger forces shaping his world, and those forces remain essential to understanding the historical context of Jesus' final days. At the same time, Barabbas occupies a unique position within the gospel narrative itself. Many individuals appear briefly in ancient historical accounts and then disappear. What distinguishes Barabbas is the moment in which he appears. His story intersects directly with one of the most consequential events in Christian history. Had his release occurred under ordinary circumstances, history would almost certainly have forgotten him. He would have become one more anonymous figure, lost within the vastness of the ancient world. Instead, his name became permanently attached to a story that would be retold across centuries, cultures, and continents. The result is a remarkable historical irony. We know almost nothing about Barabbas, yet his name remains recognizable to millions of people around the world. The mystery surrounding his later life has played a major role in preserving that fascination. Human beings are naturally drawn to unfinished stories. We want to know what happened after pivotal moments. We want to understand how extraordinary experiences shape ordinary lives. Barabbas leaves us with none of those answers. The Gospels never reveal whether he reflected on his release. They never tell us whether he remained in Jerusalem or departed immediately. They never describe whether the events of that Passover affected him profoundly or barely at all. The silence is complete. Yet rather than diminishing the story, that silence has allowed each generation to approach it with fresh curiosity. Historians investigate the available evidence. Writers imagine possibilities. Readers continue asking questions. The mystery survives because it was never fully resolved. Interestingly, the enduring influence of Barabbas extends far beyond biblical studies. His story has inspired literature, art, theater, film, and philosophical reflection. Authors have used him to explore questions of identity, destiny, guilt, freedom, and meaning. Scholars have examined him as a historical figure embedded within the political realities of Roman Judea. Theologians have reflected upon the symbolic dimensions of his release. Different communities have approached him from different perspectives, yet the fascination remains remarkably consistent. This broad appeal suggests that the story touches something universal. It raises questions that extend beyond its original historical setting. Questions about human choice, questions about justice, questions about how individuals respond when confronted with unexpected turns in life. Another reason the story continues to resonate is that it reminds us how history is often shaped by people who leave behind very little information. Modern culture tends to focus on famous leaders, celebrated thinkers, and influential public figures. Yet, much of history is carried forward by individuals whose lives survive only in fragments. Barabbas belongs to that category. We possess only a few details about him, yet those details connect him to a moment that changed the course of religious history. His story reminds us that significance and visibility are not always the same thing. A person may leave behind few records and still occupy an important place within a much larger narrative. There is also an important lesson in the limits of what we can know. Throughout this documentary, we have distinguished between evidence and speculation, history and tradition, probability and certainty. The story of Barabbas demonstrates why those distinctions matter. Ancient history rarely provides complete answers. Historians work with fragments, reconstruct contexts, and evaluate competing interpretations. Some mysteries can be solved. Others remain open. Responsible scholarship recognizes that reality, rather than attempting to force certainty where none exists. In the case of Barabbas, the unanswered questions are not failures of historical inquiry. They are reminders of the distance separating us from the ancient world. And yet, despite all the uncertainties, several things remain clear. Barabbas was a real figure remembered within the earliest gospel traditions. He lived in a society shaped by occupation, unrest, and political tension. He became involved in events serious enough to attract the attention of Roman authorities, and for a brief moment, his fate became intertwined with that of Jesus of Nazareth. Those facts alone are sufficient to explain why his story continues to matter, not because every detail has been preserved, but because the details that remain illuminate a remarkable intersection of history, politics, religion, and human experience. In the end, perhaps the most fitting way to remember Barabbas is not as a symbol, a legend, or a theological abstraction, but as a man standing at a crossroads of history. For a brief moment, the world's attention turned toward him. Then it moved on. He disappeared from the record. The mystery endured. 2,000 years later, we still find ourselves asking the same questions that have echoed across generations. Who was Barabbas? What became of him? And why has a man who spoke no recorded words and left behind almost no trace remained impossible to forget? Perhaps the answer lies in the very thing that makes his story unique. History gave us just enough to remember him, and just enough mystery to keep searching.